everyone. My name is Carlos. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the organizers and the hosts and speakers of the evening. Perversity, thanks you for coming. And as soon as I find my, we would like to acknowledge that Perversity will be taking place in unceded indigenous lands. We recognize the Ganyang-Gehaga Nation as the custodians and land of the land and waters called Yojage, Montreal, and we condemn the historical, colonial, and imperialist invasions and politics against these peoples. Cet événement se déroule sur le territoire traditionnel de Ganyang-Gehaga. L'île appelée Montréal est connue sous le nom de Yojage, Montréal dans les langues de Ganyang-Gehaga, et a toujours été un lieu de rencontre pour d'autres nations autochtones, y compris les peuples Omamiwinini ou Algonquin. Nous pensons qu'il est crucial de connaître les conséquences passées et actuelles du colonialisme. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlos. Nicola, would you like to begin with your introduction?
Okay, I'd like to thank everyone who's here. It's an event that I dreamed of for several years now, to be able to invite what we hope were part of the legacy. In Montreal, l'androgyne, Alex will represent it to you well better, but it's the first queer feminist bookstore in Montreal and has had over 40 years in activity with different people at different time. So it was really a model for us to try to follow in some ways. We're two co-hosts of the event. La librairie Le is the queer and feminist bookstore in Montreal in 1426 Rue Baudry, just across the subway. We're selling all kinds of books, children, sci-fi, fiction, non-fiction. So we love to see you here. And Perversité is a queer and trans anti-corporate festival that depends on dedicated volunteers, grants and fundraiser to run each year. So if you enjoy the festival, don't hesitate to make a donation to the 2021 edition. All funds are split equally between festival costs, for example, the Zoom, and fees for BIPOC volunteers and event organizer. I'll put the link for the GoFundMe in the page. And I'll also created a small selection of books by Will Aitken and Alex Ketchum, including 2 books to be published from Will and Alex in the chat, if you want to check it out. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Bienvenue, bonjour tout le monde. Hello and welcome everyone. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici avec vous. It's so nice to be here with all of you in this virtual space. We've enabled auto captions, which work best for English, and we're recording this event. So that's more for posterity and for kind of archives. But if you don't want your face to be shown, you can turn off your video. Alors, ce soir, on va avoir une discussion autour de la librairie L'androgyne avec les personnes qui l'ont fait vivre. So tonight we're going to have a discussion around the late androgyny bookstore, or l'androgyne, with the people who made it happen. As we reflect on the importance of l'androgyne in the creation of LGBTQ+ space here in Montreal, it's important that we are cognizant of the spaces that we occupy. And Carlos began with a bit of a land acknowledgement as well. Yojage, Montreal is on unceded Ganyang-Gehaga territory. But while this event is virtual, everything that we do is tied to the land and the space that we're on. We must always be mindful of the lands that the servers running our internet, the lands that have been mined for rare earth materials that make our computers, and the stewards of those lands that enable our virtual events. Acknowledging Canada's long colonial history and ongoing current political practices is an important step, but it's not enough. If we are interested in social justice and improving the lives of all LGBTQ and Two-Spirit peoples, we must work towards decolonization. Alors, tonight is a bilingual event, but many of tonight's speakers are Anglophone, and a lot of the event will be happening in English, but you're welcome to ask questions in French or in English, and we'll do our best to answer them. I have the great pleasure of being asked to introduce a bit of the history of l'androgyne. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Nicola from Le Bouillon, Montreal's feminist bookstore, for inviting me and also providing me with some fantastic resources about les librairies féministes au Québec. I might pop that great resource that Nicola made into the chat for you all. So if you want to have access to more articles about the history of lesbian, gay, queer, and feminist bookstores in Quebec, I'll pop that into the chat after I do the introductions. L'Androgyne, or Androgyny Bookstore, existed from 1973 to 2002 here in Montreal. During its history, it went through several major changes. It became a collective, then went back to private ownership. It had several location changes. It went from functioning in English and stocking English titles to French. Founded in 1973, Androgyny Bookstore, later L'Androgyne, was the first gay and lesbian bookstore in Quebec. It was first located on Crescent Street. And then the store space at one time was shared with Alternatives, the anarchist bookstore, whom the originators of Androgyny had teamed up with in order to pay the cost of a better location. And if the founders find any of this information to be incorrect, please correct me if I'm wrong. This is in past newspaper articles and such. It later moved to a nearby second floor building on Saint Laurent Boulevard in 1982. It was run as a collective until around 1983, 1984-ish, when the collective turned over full responsibility to Lawrence Boyle, who had already been active in the collective. Lawrence continued as the owner until he sold the store in the 1990s. And then ultimately in 2001, it moved to Amherst Street, just north of St. Catherine in the Gay Village. So some of those dates might be a little mismatched, so please correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, but that's what I could find in newspaper archives and so forth. So within the history of L'Androgyne Androgyny Bookstore, we can see the confluence of the lesbian and gay revolutions, women's rights movements, the Quiet Revolution, and changes in independent bookstore history as indie bookstores had to navigate the rise of large chain bookstores and then later online retailers such as Amazon. So many folks have formative experiences at bookstores, especially members of the LGBTQ community. Bookstores, especially in a pre-internet era, are one of the first places to find out information. Bookstores can be community centers where someone enters and finds a flyer for events, fundraisers, and more. Bookstores can host art shows and dances. They can also be a place to linger and create community inside, drinking coffee. And I found one record saying that there was a coffee machine for 25-cent coffee. So if anyone has memories to share of that, that'd be great. But people aren't here to listen to me, but want to hear from you all. So I now have the pleasure of introducing Will Aitken and Barbara Scales. And I would hope that you will help me in welcoming them to this event. And thank you everyone for coming. So thank you. So we're going to jump in right now. So Barbara and Will, in whichever order you please, can you please begin by giving us a bit of your bio and how you became part of L'Androgyne Androgyny Bookstore?
After you, Will.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, just a slight correction, Alex, that we always carried French books.
Okay.
From the very beginning. I just want to make that clear, but yeah. It started with neither Barbara nor I. It started with Bruce Garside, who was a philosophy prof at McGill, and John Southen, who was a biology prof. They had a course called Biology and Social Change in the late 60s, which was a way of talking about gay issues. And then as Gay McGill began, which was in 1972, which was also when I came to Montreal to study at McGill, I met Bruce. We ended up partners, and he was so publicly gay by then that his department wanted to fire him. He negotiated a settlement so he could leave. The money from that, and then from John Southen, was the seed money for the bookstore in '73, I think. Is that right, Barbara?
Yeah, that's right. So maybe I can pick up a little bit. So, so Will came in via Bruce, really, and I didn't know John then, but I got to know him much better, and I worked with him at the residence. But Bruce had been a favorite philosophy professor of mine at McGill, and I finished a master's eventually in philosophy at McGill, but I finished it when Bruce was no longer there, unfortunately. But Bruce and Will and John at one point came to me and said that they wanted to start a gay, lesbian, feminist, non-sexist children's bookstore, and would I, and they needed a woman. I think that was part of it. And so, it was something that appealed to me very much. I'd been involved in bookstores in various ways for my life, and mostly as a consumer of books from bookstores. The idea really appealed to me very much. So I did come on, but I was the one of the four of us who needed some income. So I was sort of the employee. And is that right? Is that how you remember it, Will? Anyway, I was at the bookstore almost daily.
Yeah, because I don't think there was any more money to pay anybody else.
No, that's right.
And
so
also
whatever
I was working as a
on your master's at the time, yeah.
Yeah, but I was also working as a graphic designer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, weirdly enough.
So, and I don't remember how long, whether it was 2 years that I was there full time, basically full time, or maybe a little more. But it was actually quite wonderful. If I can launch into some of the activity there, it was books. I mean, the four of us, really the three of us, not John. John was kind of the silent partner, but the three of us were largely responsible for ordering the books and deciding which books to carry. And part of my job was to be involved with largely the feminist and the non-sexist children's books. So we had a wonderful small space on Crescent Street with, there were no such things as microwaves, but we had a coffee machine. I don't recall it being 25 cents for a coffee, but what in fact, the dynamic in the bookstore was, the social dynamic was that it was very rare. You think back, folks, think back to a time when you, not only would you not want your face to be seen, but you probably didn't want to be seen at all anywhere near such a place. So people would come in with a lot of trepidation. They would open the door, they might close the door, they might just come in and stare at the books and wander around. And usually there was not more than one person at a time in the bookstore. Occasionally, two people might come in together. A lot of people who came in the early days were older gentlemen who some would say to me, you know, I don't go to the dances because the gay dances had started at Gay McGill and they were wonderful. But, you know, these were not gentlemen who felt that dances were how they wanted to meet people, nor bars probably for the ones who came in. So they thought that the bookstore could be a good place for them to come and feel a sense of community. It was a place where people would, after a time, either on a first visit or on a second or third visit, come and enjoy sitting down with a cup of coffee and having a conversation. So in fact, I ended up having a lot of conversations with people whom I didn't know. I couldn't tell you their names for the most part, but it was a wonderful opportunity for me, and I think very much for them, which is why they would come back, to talk about anything, but with somebody with whom they felt comfortable. Does that sound familiar, Will?
Very, very familiar. There were so many people who just, you could tell they just had a really pressing need to unburden themselves.
Yeah. Because,
you know, they were either completely closeted or, you know, terrified or married or whatever. I know men who came in their first visit would frequently come to the cash with a non-sexist children's book on top, and then the sort of Gay Sunshine magazine or whatever slipped underneath. But yeah, it was really, it became very quickly, in addition to being a bookstore, a kind of community outreach thing where we didn't have money to advertise. Did we advertise at all?
No.
So there was no money. So it was all word of mouth. Yeah. And it was surprising how quickly that grew.
I remember doing a radio interview with you at Concordia, maybe when you were, I can't remember how that came about. Anyway, we went off to Concordia and did an interview, but it wasn't something that the media paid much attention to, frankly. I want to mention one extraordinary visit, which was really an unforgettable moment. There's a woman named Shakuntala Devi, who was known as the human computer. And she was an Indian woman of, I don't know what caste she was in, but it certainly was in the upper echelons of castes in India. And she was truly a remarkable brain who was going around the world giving demonstrations of how, remember, this is all early days of computers. And so she would go and do competitions with computers, and she would arrive at the 73rd decimal of a calculation before the computer, or she would have it right and the computer would be off by a digit, something like that. And she was going to give a demonstration of her skills at McGill in the math department that evening. But she walked into the store in full sari with her dot on her forehead. And
Mindy.
Sorry?
The Mindy.
A Mindy, thank you. And, I didn't know that. Thank you. And she, and I thought, does she know where she's come? But instantly she took charge of the situation, and I don't recall now whether it was her husband or her brother, was homosexual, as one says in India, in the British Commonwealth. And of course, as part of the British, as a British colony, it was still operating under Victorian law, where homosexuality was outlawed. And her husband, brother, her family member was in danger. And she decided that because she was such a well-established human being in India, she did the census for the Indian government. Her brain did the census, get this, for India, right? She thought that she, and probably she alone, could write a book about homosexuality, which would make it something legitimate, and campaign and move India towards recognition of gay rights. And so she stayed for 4 hours. And I kept thinking, you have a show tonight, lady, but she stayed for 4 hours. She left with piles of books, and she went off. I didn't go to her demonstration that evening, but I did read. She died a few years ago, and in her obituary, it refers to the fact that she wrote this book about homosexuality and campaigning for its legitimacy in India. And it's in her Wikipedia entry, it also talks about this. So that was one of the great visits. There were many other very interesting people. John Hirsch's partner, who lived in what is now the Trudeau House he was a paint supply importer and probably made a fair sum. And
Jacques.
Sorry, Jacques, right.
Jacques Vadervellen, yeah.
Jacques Vadervellen, right, thank you. And he came in often, and once he phoned me and said, could you deliver these books to my house? And I said, okay. And he told me where his house was, and I went and delivered, and he said, now that you're here, can I give you a tour of the house? And I have to say, it's a pretty gorgeous house.
Okay.
Yes.
He used to have roller skating parties because the whole house was marble.
Right.
Walls, everything else.
Wow.
So everybody would drop acid and then we'd roller skate, all night long.
I see. Okay.
One of the
I was never invited, Will.
Oh no.
It's okay.
Okay. But I think in addition to the people we met, how hard it was then to find any kind of literature, gay, lesbian, even feminist literature in 1973, and how we had to I mean, there was no way to research it except to go to like other bookstores like Glad Day in Toronto, or what was the one in on Christopher Street in New York?
Yeah.
Called Christopher Street? I don't know.
The
Anyway,
Oscar Wilde bookstore.
that's
Oscar
it.
Wilde,
That's
right.
it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No memory here at all. And so we would just go and figure out what they were ordering. And then ordering in Canada, you'd call publishers and say, you know, lesbian, gay, non-sexist books, and they'd say, sorry, no way.
Well, also at the time, there weren't that many authors who were either known to be gay or lesbian or who would confess to it.
Yeah.
I mean, but people who have since been identified historically, historical figures, historical writers, that is dead writers,
Right.
who were not then acknowledged necessarily as being gay.
I remember we carried E.M. Forster because he had just posthumously come out with the publication of Maurice.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So was it that your strategy for inventory was then like anything you could find? Would you also like bring books over from the States? Would there be like that you would like cart books across the border at all? Or was it just really trying to?
No, you can't really do business that way because you have to sell them and declare, you know, but it wasn't that difficult. At least I don't recall it being that difficult to order books and have them come by Canada Post.
Okay.
You didn't have to go to customs.
Okay.
Oh, I didn't.
That was my job, to go to customs in Old
Right.
Montreal. And it all depended on which agent you got, whether material got through. And we're not talking about pornography in any shape or form. I went one day and there was Gay Sunshine Again, which was a radical publication. And it had a picture of two shirtless men holding on to each other on the cover. And the agent said, no way, that's obscene. And he confiscated it. And you had no recourse. And then I went back 2 weeks later and that guy was still there. But then this younger guy came rushing to the counter and said to the other guy, he said, why don't you go get a coffee? And he looked at me, he said, les androgynes. And he passed everything. So it was, if we could get him, if he would be there when I was there, we could get anything through. But there were a lot of nasty old guys who were just like, forget about it.
Yeah.
Do either of you recall how the name was chosen? Why did you pick androgyny for the name of the bookstore? I mean, like, of the possibilities of names, there's.
I think, Barbara, you can contradict me if I'm wrong here. I think it came from the book Portrait of a Marriage, about Vida Sackville-West and her husband and their open and also gay and lesbian relationship. And there was a lot of discussion in that book about androgyny as both a political and a personal choice. And so that kind of came up when we were all talking. I don't know, is that your memory as well, Barbara? Actually,
I'm not sure I knew that story, but I think it does come from the Bloomsbury culture in a way, and Virginia Woolf and those folks. Virginia Woolf's novel
Orlando.
Yeah. I kept thinking ice skating, but yeah, Orlando. It opens on a skating on the Thames because it's frozen, and yeah, right. So yeah.
And there was when the term was turned into French, it was actually, they chose the wrong term. It should have been l'androgynie, because an androgyne is something quite different from being androgynous.
I see.
That's something explained to me the minute we made the sign.
Oops. So how long did we hang on to the store as just whatever it was, our little quartet before I think what happened, there were people like Lawrence and Paul Keenan who came along and said, you know, we'd like to work here too. And there was no money. And they said, well, we'll volunteer. And so they started coming in and they would do, you know, there would be more activity of the collective. And also I think more through their connections, they like to invite their friends. And so it became a more active and dynamic scene, as it were. But it was no longer so much for the older gentlemen or the random seekers of body politic. I mean, a lot of people did come in to get the newspapers, the weeklies or the monthlies or whatever they were. Body Politic was there, and I don't remember all, but it was, hi Karen. It was, it sort of evolved slowly towards a lot of people being interested in being involved in it. And they brought in, I only remember Paul and Lawrence really, and then some women joined the group, and I'm not quite sure what, it seemed to me that they all knew each other from an organization, but I wasn't sure what it was. And eventually some negotiations, real backroom negotiations, were handled by John Southen and Bruce, I guess, as the co-owners. And we sold the store to the collective for big bucks, $1, right?
I didn't know it was sold then, because it was
not immediately.
We sold it in '81 for $1 to Philip Rappaport, who knew Lawrence, and they somehow,
I see.
Bruce and I, after 2 years there, had discovered that we were horrible businessmen. And Bruce was retraining to be a social worker. I was involved with a huge battle with McGill because my master's thesis was failed because I identified myself as gay in the intro about a thesis about Christopher Isherwood. So for 18 months, that was like my main preoccupation, because I had teaching jobs, but they depended on me getting a master's degree. So Bruce and I gradually drifted away, and the collective, took over and did a bang-up job.
And I can't remember when I stopped actually working there, but I think in 1978 or 79, I organized a conference with Barbara, then Hepner, later Nichols, Barbara Nichols, who was a professor, a newly minted professor of social work. We organized a conference called Planning for a Non-Sexist Society. And Basha Helwig designed the button, which was,
I remember that,
a white button with nothing on it. And the idea was that it was, imagine. Right? We should mention the presence of Black Rose Books. For a while before the collective came along, I think possibly another one of those backroom financial deals, trying to see how to sustain a possible business model. Dimitri Rosopoulos and Black Rose Books came along and proposed they literally, I think they took, 2 shelves, something like that, or maybe, one set of shelves. And it became Androgyny Black Rose for a short period of time. I'm not sure how long.
Yeah, because I remember that our original conception of the store was to cast as wide a net as possible, and to be as eclectic as possible, and to try to appeal to as many different tastes. And Dimitri was, after he'd been collaborating with us a while, he became really uncomfortable with that, because he thought that we should really narrow our scope. And so I think that kind of led to him exiting. I think it was amicable, but it was just a question of a vision of the store, I think.
Mm-hmm. I wasn't aware of the reasons for his leaving, but I I mean, he has a disciplined sense of anarchism. So
He's the most disciplined anarchist I've ever met.
yeah.
You both had mentioned the bookstore's relationship to the lesbian and gay bookstores in Toronto and in New York City. But what was your relationship to other Montreal bookstores at the time when you were working there?
I just went to work every day,
Okay.
drank coffee, you know, and met whoever came in the store. I didn't really have that much time to go and meet people. I mean, or go to other stores, but I was involved through the McGill Women's Union, which we had started. I mean, others of us, Basha Helwig being one, and Susan Gottheil. I had some connections more in the women's organizations in Montreal, but, you know, a lot of Anglophone women, a lot of Anglophone people were leaving the city in droves in the 70s, and it was really sad. And as a New Yorker who migrated to Montreal, I just missed them, and I was really sorry, but I wasn't going to leave. I came here, I chose it, and, you know, I've stayed, and I love it. Yeah. But, you know, I guess I went to the gay dances. I can't remember what year it was, but I had friends in San Francisco who were organizing the quilt tour, the AIDS quilt. And they had contacts with an organization in Montreal, which was having, it must have been a few years later, because I had already started my arts business by then. So it was probably in the 80s. So this is nothing really to do with androgyny, but the organization in Montreal that had been approached to present the quilt was not getting it done. So these friends in San Francisco asked me to, you know, could I take it over? So I did, and it was actually quite, yeah, it was quite interesting. We did it at the Olympic Park in the old Velodrome, I think, and I think Robert Lepage had time. I think he did something with the opening event of it. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. It was a very cool thing. And in my life, it was part of the overflow, I guess, from having been connected to androgyny. But I didn't stay involved with the store once it became a collective, because it was no longer doing what I had enjoyed so much and what it meant to me. And not that I had come to it only in that spirit, but it was no longer what I had been making at that time. So, you know, it was fine for this wonderful group of people to take it on and carry it forward. And clearly it had a good long life for another 25 years or so. Yeah.
I'm wondering, because you had mentioned a bit about like kind of like changing demographics in terms of like the original kind of older gentlemen who came in, and then kind of more of like the dance scene that came in, and like the changing role with volunteers. And I had found some records of kind of dances that had been hosted by Androgyny Bookstore and then Flogine, and different fundraisers. Did that happen at the same time that you all were there, or was that more like during the collective years? Okay. Okay.
I think like the dances that Barbara mentioned, again, were organized by Bruce at McGill in the Students' Union. And everybody laughed at him and said, well, you'll get 50 people. And the first night we got 2,000.
Oh, wow.
and the crowd was like hugely francophone. I mean, there were obviously people from McGill, but a lot of them were scared to go. You know, they might meet their friends, which would tell them about their friends, but they didn't get that far in terms of logic. So these things were enormously successful, but their money went into Gay McGill in terms of, you know, furthering educational and social outreach programs there.
And just to be maybe a little complete, Bruce went on not just as after he left McGill and in the time that androgyny was starting up, he was studying to become a social worker. Correct me if I get this wrong, but he founded Ville Marie Social Services, which or certainly the gay counseling element of
Yeah.
Marie. And that was a really an incredibly important contribution. And of course, good advertisement for the for the bookstore. But I think the bookstore had a kind of a link to that spirit of, you know, creating context for gay culture, gay life, and gay living, and as the social services was.
And Bruce wanted to train as a psychoanalyst originally, but the Psychoanalytic Association of both Canada and the United States said he couldn't do that because he was gay.
Mm.
So then he went into social work, and I think was much happier because he could actually work at grassroots level with, he founded the gay youth group in the mid 1970s with Ville Marie Social Services, and just was raised the profile of the community in sort of more or less official institutions in Montreal.
Yeah. And maybe a little bit about, if you don't mind, Alex, a little bit about John. I mean, I eventually got to know John extremely well because I went in, I can't remember which year, 78 maybe, for about 4 years to work at the residences with him. He was head of the residences at McGill up on the mountain. It was just the 3 or 4 buildings for, I don't know, 25 or 30 years. And Karen Messing is here. She also might know more about John's biography, but he was a biologist who was, you know, a very extremely bright a Canadian who went off to UCLA when he was a kid. I think he went from first year to university to his doctorate in 7 years, and also established the biology department at University of Havana after the revolution, and was, my understanding from when John died, we had a little gathering at my place, and Bruce was saying that it was not at Gay McGill that he and John had met, but it was through the anti-war movement in the later 60s or maybe early 70s, but I think it was the 60s. So they had met through the anti-war movement and at McGill in the faculty.
But really even more precisely than that, through the War Resisters and Draft Dodgers organization. That's how they first got going. Yeah.
Yeah. So the sense that there was a continuity between a number of social concerns or a sense of making a better world, that's very much in their biographies.
Amazing. I just want to say for people attending, there will also be time for you all to ask questions, or I know some people that are attending also partook in the bookstore, so also to share memories as well. But I just have a couple more questions. And so if you want to put questions also in the chat, if you don't feel comfortable asking them on camera, you're welcome to do that. So yeah, I'll actually read one of the questions from Carlos from Capacite, who wrote, "I'd like to know what kind of content was being created by these movements, if you can remember any."
Content meaning books, Carlos? Is that, or dynamics or activity or?
Yeah, no, I mean literature. Yeah, what kind of books or content? You know,
it was Will Aitken's
publications.
My book.
Yeah, Will, would you like to talk about your books a bit?
Oh, well, I mean, I guess that was the other reason that I was kind of drifting away from Landorgen, because I was trying to become a writer, but I didn't really, I mean, I worked as a journalist. I worked for the CBC and the Globe and Mail and a bunch of other places, mainly as an arts critic and a film critic and an arts journalist. But I didn't actually publish books until my first book was in 1989, which was definitely a gay book and got huge amounts of opposition at every turn. So the homophobia that existed in 1973 was phenomenal. It was everywhere. It was the atmosphere we breathed. And you would think, by the end of the 1980s that would have changed. I think it had changed at the street level, but it hadn't changed at the institutional level. When I first started with the CBC and was on air, there was a producer who worked with me for months to get what he called the smile out of my voice, which was a CBC way of saying you sound like a fag, and you gotta tone that down. And I resisted the whole way. It was irritating how slowly progress happened.
I guess with this topic of progress as well, when you look back on kind of the 30-year legacy of the bookstore, I know you were all involved in the beginning years, but like, how do you feel about that kind of legacy that Membrochin left as a bookstore and kind of as like this institution in lesbian and gay and queer Montreal history?
I think probably one of the, I recall at the time when the bookstore was sort of winding down. It was still on Saint Laurent, but the collective was sort of winding down, and I don't know the exact details because I wasn't that closely tied to it anymore. But my understanding was that the world had changed so much that regular bookstores were regular commercial bookstores that aim to make money were selling the products that Androgyny had been selling, and that there was, at least in some sense, there was no longer a need for this sort of specialized bookstore, and that the opportunity for encounters in other ways had also been surpassed by other institutions. But I think that in a way the best legacy is the fact that it was not a necessary institution, although I'm sure that's discussable. And I think the presence of Le Guélion is really a wonderful opportunity for a sense of renewal and in that spirit of a special place. So it's not just about buying the books, it's about having a community of interested people and interesting people, not just in any book that a bookstore might carry, but in this particular array of books. And I love going to Le Guélion. I don't go often enough, but when I do, I'm always impressed by the array of work, and also now the Indigenous collection and artwork that is there. So what's the legacy of Androgyny? I mean, part of it is, I think, that people like Nicolas and the people who founded Le Guélion are sensitive to that heritage.
Yeah, I think they continue the kind of communitarian drive of l'androgyne, that it's always the sense of reaching out and continuing a fine tradition. I mean, if we didn't have our literary tradition and our arts tradition, I mean, what would be left?
Yeah. Thank you. And we have another question from an audience member, Fallon, who writes, "Thank you for your amazing presentation. I would like to know if gay and lesbians engage with that space the same way, or if they had a different relationship to the library. And perhaps like the content within the library and the bookstore would have been different at the time based off of availability of books, but maybe you can reflect on that a bit more." Or Fallon, if you also want to add a few more words to clarify your question, if you'd like, but no pressure.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, my first language is not English. But I was wondering, because I don't know, in that year was hard to be gay, it was harder to be lesbian also, or like, so I was wondering how lesbian engage in a public space at the beginning of the library. Was it more like men coming and then gradually in the 80s, late 80s, lesbians? I was just wondering, what about lesbians in Androgyne?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I have to say it was, I think from the time I was there, my memory is that it was far more men coming in than women. Yeah, just like that. There were just far more men coming in. I don't know if it's a matter of different kind of socializing. And it wasn't just older men, but that was a particularly significant demographic that came in. Women tended to come in couples and not to be as sociable generally, except Madame Shankutala Devi. And she was an exception. I mean, there were also other people who came in gradually. Some people would make it a meeting point. So people would come and say, I'll meet you at Androgyny. And this, as people became more comfortable, and sometimes it was women and sometimes it was men. I think though that generally the sense of the challenge that this bookstore represented was something that was more engaged in through gay men than through lesbians. My guess is that the socializing was of a different sort and probably more intimate. But I did meet some wonderful people, ex-nun and various sorts of adventures. Some women I knew from McGill were really happy to be able to find this place and the opportunity to explore literature, ideas, some of the nonfiction, although I'm not able to focus exactly and remember what that might have been. Seems to me there was much more nonfiction in relation to male homosexuality. Of course, that Queen Victoria said that it was impossible that women would be homosexual. So that, in fact, there's no law against homosexuality in the British tradition, because when the law was passed against male homosexuality, Queen Victoria said, women would never do such a thing. So it just was erased from the book. So perhaps the issues were not in the English language tradition, at least, perhaps the issues were not so urgent in terms of the legal issues that were involved in the illegality of male homosexuality.
I thought very early on, we carried, not a huge amount of feminist and queer theory and lesbian theory, what was available. I remember Sisterhood is Powerful, and we carried the deuxième sexe, and, all the kind of staples. And then as we heard about, or as people came in and
Kate
said,
Millett and
Kate Millett, that kind of
the
thing.
second wave.
Yes, and I think also it was the same for men in terms of the non-sexist children's books allowed an entry for lesbians, because they could come in and look at them. And also we met, Bruce and I, who were a couple and we had young kids, we met a number of lesbian couples who had kids. And that was a revelation for us, because we felt very isolated at first, bringing up toddlers.
Right. But did you meet through the bookstore, or was the bookstore just an additional element in that dynamic?
No, we met largely through the bookstore. That even I remember, couples would come in with their kids, and we were just like, oh, this is happening. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm wondering again, I know the dynamics of the collective after was different, but was the collective somewhat gender balanced, or was it primarily men also, at least the kind of initial next group of people that came in? Can you speak to that at all, or?
I had very little to do with the collective, and my sense was that there were a couple of sort of maverick women, but it was largely male run or male led. I shouldn't say run, but male led and initiated. would that be what you knew, Will? Or
I only went to a couple of collective meetings, and I had the impression it was more like 2/3 male, 1/3 female. But that could have been the meetings I was at.
if I may say, I saw a couple of the exchanges on the Androgyny Gone But Not Forgotten website when Nicolas had appealed to people to come and participate in this. And I think it's interesting that there is nobody from the collective who is here. But my sense is that collectives don't always end well. So I mean, there are so many. One of the things that I did that I can say about the collective is that it was very much a collective of struggle. People wanted to struggle over various issues, and do we do this? Do we do that? Do we sell these? Do we don't? We don't do that. Do we encourage that? What do we do with porn? What do we do with articles, objects, thingies? I don't know what you call them, but anyway, sex toys. I mean,
collective meetings, they went through what they were ordering and discussed each thing. Because I remember they wanted to stop carrying The Advocate from Los Angeles, not because it was pornographic, but because its personals ads were, from their point of view, from many in the collective's point of view, pornographic.
Yeah, there were political, social, cultural issues. And honestly, that was another factor. I just didn't want to get involved in those. And I was, I didn't feel I needed to be part of all that struggle. Looks like Robert has a question.
Yeah, more, first of all, I'm really enjoying this and learning a lot about the early years of androgyny. I moved to Montreal the first time at the end of 1980. And so I remember the store moving. And in fact, the reason I remember is because at the time, I helped my partner at the time, Bruce, build the bookshelves for the new store on Saint Laurent. Okay. So, just to give you an idea of the financial precarity of the store, this was kind of volunteer work, done with pleasure. I do remember at the time, obviously I remember Paul and Lawrence and Philip, and there were also one or two women who were regularly behind the cash in the bookstore. And it did become a kind of meeting place. And, it's true. I mean, friends would say to each other, well, I'll meet you at Androgyny. And there was something very nice about the Saint Laurent location, because Saint Laurent was already a kind of eclectic street that had all kinds of non-orthodox things going on all along it. And what Will said about people looking around before they entered, scoping out the area, that was certainly true on Crescent Street, and maybe just a little bit less on Saint Laurent.
Well,
one thing that I wanted to ask, it was years later too. And one of the things I wanted to ask about, if you have any, there was a lot of controversy when the bookstore decided to move from Saint Laurent to Amherst, old name of the street, now an axe-wielding enterprise, which is what is in that space. But it was precisely the kind of debate you were talking about. There was this idea that the village was developing very much as a commercial space for bars, saunas, things like this, and that people who read books weren't necessarily going to go over there to look for a bookstore. So this was, this is several years ago. And in fact, what people wanted from the bookstore when it relocated was porn, sort of various kinds of, tchotchkes, as we would say, coffee mugs or whatever, but less and less books. So there were people at the time who felt that the move kind of doomed the store. And you've brought up all kinds of other reasons why the store couldn't survive, but I'm wondering, whether you have any views on that.
Well, Pre-op, which did carry porn, and I think still does, when they bought out Landaugen, and they said their plan was to, somehow expand both stores and, have a wonderful, atmosphere between the two and giving people a choice. And then it became very clear that they bought Landaugen in order to close it. They didn't want any competition. Even though Landaugen really wasn't competition, because they were selling totally different kinds of literature and videos, and remember videos and
I have a whole shelf of them.
right. Technologies.
Interesting. Yeah.
Oh, Andrew, you have a question, but I don't see the question. I just see that question was for everyone. Can you restate your question or repeat
the previous question? I guess my question is that you talked about having a lot of literature for gays and lesbians, but also feminist literature. And you mentioned, Barbara, I think that by the 1990s or whatever, you could get that stuff in commercial bookstores anyway. I'm just wondering, in that earlier era, did feminists, as much as gays and lesbians, identify with the bookstore? Did they were they a big part of the clientele?
They came, certainly. I mean, some people came, and some people did come to discover things, or to see if there was something that they could discover that they wouldn't find someplace else. And I think at that time there probably was. Part of it was finding it all in the same place and celebrated, as it were. Did feminists come? They did, but I don't.
More at Saint Laurent.
More on Saint Laurent, yeah. I think, yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I ask because today we talk a lot more about intersectionality, diversity, and so all these different things where it's become like all the same people who are kind of realize that they have to work on these issues in solidarity. And I'm just wondering, how that would have evolved, and did that have any roots back then?
That's a very good question. I think a lot of women didn't want to necessarily be associated with the gay community.
Right.
They felt that it, there were issues about, is it polite? Is it over the top? Is it, I think you had to really be open to enjoying it. And I think a lot of women may not have felt, tu casa, mi casa, they may have sort of thought, well, I've got my struggle and what are you doing here? Kind of, I mean, there's always been that kind of division. I don't think anybody ever said it to me outright, but my sense is, recalling this, that, a lot of women just sort of thought, well, they wanted to have their own thing, and perhaps because it was it's to some degree really focused on my computer's doing things, focused on male gay material, maybe it was off-putting, but it's a shame if that led people to stay away, because it was really a wonderful opportunity, I think. There were certainly women who came, and I think there were certainly women who weren't necessarily gay women, but some women who were bisexual women, or some women who were not sure, and some women who were interested in literature, and some women who just wanted to come and talk. Yeah.
I'm wondering, just because I want to be mindful of your time or speaker's time, because we had scheduled till 7, if there's like maybe 1 or 2 more audience questions before we wrap up.
Or comments, because I think there are probably people here who knew the later incarnations of androgyny.
Yeah, Sayaka, or I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Please correct me.
You said it perfectly. Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. So interesting. I currently work at Le Guélion. I started recently, and I'm part of the new generation when it comes to these kinds of spaces and trying to find better ways to communicate and to be better allies. And I also come from Latinx community, and I was wondering if you have maybe some tips or maybe some, I don't know, maybe some knowledge for the younger generations like mine, where I'm 22 years old, and we're trying to see what we can learn from these spaces, as I find that we have lost a bit of that today. Yes, we have Le Guélion, but let's say even in academic spaces, I find that it's very difficult because there's always competition as to who is right and who isn't, and who has the biggest struggles and who doesn't. And I was wondering if you have maybe some tips or ideas about how we can have better communication skills and how we can deploy better spaces or better safe spaces for people like us.
Look, I studied philosophy with Bruce Garside. And one of the things that I learned is the difference between opinion, belief, and truth. And so I really try, I can be very opinionated, but I like to at least be able to acknowledge that it's only an opinion. And I think that's kind of important in any movement, because people kill for opinions most of the time. I mean, wars are, if they're not over water or resources, they're often over opinions, beliefs. My God is better than your God. Her name is longer than your name. I don't know. So I think I would suggest that that's one thing to bear in mind, that there is a difference between an opinion that you may form with consideration or on the fly, and a belief that may be more considered, and the truth, which is probably tricky to find. And so it's good to listening to other people, and understanding the nature of argument and debate is more important than being right, I think. I'm right?
Yes.
Yes.
Indubitably.
Yeah, indubitably, yeah. I want to mention that Karen Messing is here, and she has published a couple of books that would be interesting, I think, for Le Guélion, if they're not already in your shelves. And one of them is a recent book called Bent Out of Shape. Karen, what's the subtitle? I'm not sure she's actually paying attention. Karen, Bent Out of Shape is about women and work. Thanks.
Shame, solidarity, and women's bodies at work. But I should say that Nicolas has been wonderful about promoting my previous book, Souffrance Invisible. And so I just want to make sure he knows that I just got the épreuve of the French version of Bent Out of Shape today, and it's coming out at the end of the month. And I will be sure to be in contact with Le Guélion about it.
Yeah, Nicolas is leaving Le Guélion, but Sayaka, right? Yeah.
But I can really recommend Karen Messing. She was one of the first big name that came to the store that I remember. Probably one of the first anecdotes, and I really liked her book, and the Les Souffrances Invisibles. I've seen the Bent Out of Shape. I haven't bought it yet, but I'll be sure to do that as soon as possible.
Is there time for me to plug my new book?
Let's go for it.
As long as we're doing this. It's not coming out until Christmas time, but it's called The Swells, and it's a lesbian-centered story about a mutiny by the crew on a luxury cruise liner. And it's satire, and it's very dark, with a Marxist bent.
And very wet.
And very wet, yes, all the way through.
See. Sayaka, one other thing that I would suggest, and I excuse my ignorance, but I think book clubs or book groups, small book groups, is a really great initiative, and maybe something like that can be developed through the bookstore. I don't know if you do it already, but yeah.
We do have like
nonfiction, all kinds of
encounters, audience, and readers, where we invite readers and we invite a lot of different authors issued from different communities in Montreal to come and speak at the bookstore. But I do think it's also a very good idea for academic spaces. I think that we have lost that. It's like we talk to each other through our papers, but we don't talk to each other face to face when it comes to discussing literature and discussing spaces. And I feel like your idea could be super interesting for academic spaces. And I will make sure to suggest that to my department, at least at UQAM. So thank you.
Good.
While we're plugging away. It's a plug for my daughter's book, For the Love of Men, which just came out in French this spring, Pour l'amour des hommes, a new vision for mindful masculinity. It's gotten some very good reviews, including an excellent review in last weekend's Globe and Mail.
Great.
It's a very good seller at Gillian. Very, very good. English and French version.
I guess just to wrap up with a final question, as we've been kind of thinking about the past and the present, and now kind of looking towards the future and how the past can inform that. Because there are some people on this call that aren't in Montreal, or some people that are interested in getting involved in lesbian, gay, queer bookstores. I was wondering, because, like, for example, Will, you mentioned, there were some business mistakes made in the beginning. You talked about kind of like different trials and tribulations. Maybe would you be interested in sharing a bit of advice, kind of like from the practical side of starting an LGBTQ bookstore? And what advice would you give to people who are interested in doing that themselves?
Good question. I would say do a lot of research, because publishing, even without gay and lesbian issues, is incredibly complicated and headache producing, and books never ship on time, and anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So the more research that you have in terms of the focus of your store, what kind of books you're going to have, what kind you aren't, all those kind of things, that I think that really has to, we did it on the fly. We did it as things, developed. But if you could work those things out first, I think it could lead to a smoother running experience. Although we did okay. I mean, 31 years is
it's extraordinary. 5 years is if you can make it to 5 years, you've made it. I want to say one thing though, to say, oh, Karen, go ahead. Karen, you were speaking.
I was speaking to somebody who asked me where his telephone was. And I
see.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. One thing I would like to say to Sayaka and Nicolas, or anybody else who's involved in a bookstore, is probably the most wonderful thing you can do for yourself and your public is to read the books. It's just, even the bad ones, read them and know them and understand them and read about them and just stay on. I mean, it's an incredible opportunity to be involved in the world of, to be involved in the world of books through running a bookstore. I mean, there's nothing quite like it. And I wish you much, much, much success and much joy with those things called books. Yeah.
Me too.
Well, thank you, Will, and thank you, Barbara, for your time, and thank you, Nicolas, for organizing this, and thank you to L'Aiguillon for hosting this, and to Perversité and Carlos. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and I hope you check out the rest of the Perversité schedule. There's so many great events to attend. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex, for this wonderful event, and thank you, Barbara and Will and everybody for this wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Great to see you all, and great to see you, Will.
Yes, it doesn't happen often enough.
Thank you. It was so lovely to learn from you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, Andrew.
Thanks.
Coffee sometime. Bye.
Yeah, hope so.
Yeah.